Hello, hello, hello. I'm Darla Spence-Coffey. I'm President and CEO of CSWE, and I am just so happy that you have joined us here, the largest gathering of social work educators in the US and beyond. We've had a fabulous meeting so far. I hope you've appreciated the ways in which our theme of leading critical conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion have really been woven throughout the events and sessions over the week. Thank you to all of our conference presenters for helping us to do this in some truly amazing ways. Looking forward to checking out many of these on-demand sessions myself after the conference is over. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to join us today for what's become a signature event at our annual program meeting, which is the Hokenstad International Lecture. CSWE benefits from those among us that remind us how important it is to prepare social workers for a global world. And this lecture is one way to keep our focus on that. Before I turn things over to Dr. Sandra Starks, who is the chair of the CSWE Board of Directors, I'd like to thank the sponsors for this event. We've got Case Western Reserve and Walden University. Very much appreciate your support for this event. And now I'm going to toss things over to Sandra.
Thank you, Darla. Good afternoon, and wow. Yes, I'm not muted. Wow, what a conference so far. Good afternoon again. I bring you greetings from the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the Department of Social Work at Western Kentucky University, which is located in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I am Sandra Starks, chair of the CSWE Board of Directors, and glad to be here today to help welcome our keynote speaker. The Hokenstad Lecturer is selected each year by a committee of the Commission on Global Social Work Education. And they've done an amazing job with the speaker selection this year, as always. The Global Commission is chaired by Rebecca Thomas, professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. The lecture series was launched in 2007 through an endowment from Dr. M.C., or Terry, as most of us know him, Hokenstad, a former president and longtime member of CSWE, and a friend and mentor to many. This lecture serves to enhance and complement the work of the Catherine A. Kendall Institute for International Social Work Education, as well as CSWE's Commission on Global Social Work Education. This is an international session, and we're glad for the opportunity to provide space for all nations, including Indigenous nations. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples once had and continue to have extended networks of communities that include human and non-human life across diverse geopolitical and ecological spaces. CSWE recognizes and respects all Indigenous peoples, their histories, their sovereign political rights, and their sacred ties to the land and waters. Please know that CSWE takes this land acknowledgement that was just approved by the board very seriously, and we have further information on the CSWE website. So I'm excited about today's speaker. I'm looking forward to her message. Darla, I'll pass the mic back to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm just so thrilled that the board of directors approved that we always integrate a land acknowledgement in the many activities of CSWE. That was beautifully done. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who is our 2020 Hokenstad Lecturer. A member of the Gitxsan First Nation, Dr. Blackstock is honored to serve as the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and is a professor at McGill University's School of Social Work. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights and has published more than 75 articles on topics relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare, and human rights. She recently served on the Pan American Health Commission on health equity and inequity, and fundamentally believes that culturally based equity is fundamental to meaningful reconciliation. Her lecture today is titled Colonialism in 2020, seeking equity for nations within nations. We tend to think of colonization as something that happened in our past, but people of First Nations continue to experience colonization, violence, and neglect by the nations in which they are geographically located. Dr. Blackstock will highlight this for us and offer examples of how social workers can successfully advocate for human rights of First Nations peoples. Dr. Blackstock, it is my great pleasure to ask you to come on and present your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Darla and Sandra. What a great honor to join you here from Treaty 6 territory and to recognize all of the Indigenous territories where you join us from, wherever you are in the world. It is indeed a real pleasure for me. You know, this past week, a First Nations young boy in Northern Ontario who lives in a community where there's been a boil water advisory for 25 years, and where just a few weeks ago, during the middle of the pandemic, all waters ceased to flow, felt it was necessary to get onto social media to plead for clean drinking water for him, for the other children in the community, so that they could go home. And he also felt it was necessary to tell the government of Canada that we are not animals, that we are human. That type of story really is shocking in a first world democracy, in a country like Canada that has promoted human rights all over the world. And yet the story is not unique. It's often a shared experience of Indigenous children in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, and indeed worldwide. So what is colonialism and how can we as social workers understand it better? Well, it begins by really recognizing that when we do the land acknowledgement, as was just beautifully done by Sandra, we are calling our attention to the distinct knowledges and experiences of Indigenous peoples from that particular nation. And it's important to realize that Indigenous nations had their own governing systems, their own education systems, their own children's systems, their own economic systems before 1492 in North America. And we have not spent enough time, I think, really thinking about what are the differences? What are some of those differences in worldview that informed that level of caring for Indigenous children by Indigenous communities prior to 1492 and echoes forward today? And that often is associated with social work that really is baked within a Western DNA structure. Now, what I'm about to offer you are very generalizations. And so I want you to take them at that level, but I think it's sometimes helpful to situate the different ways that we look at the world. In a First Nations worldview, the ancestors are considered mostly right. They've had, after all, experience raising thousands of generations of children within a culturally based construct that has worked for them. But in Western knowledge, we often think that the ancestors were mostly wrong. And that's why we in academia particularly give preference to new articles. It's not necessarily that they're better. Often those of us who even give preference to new articles are actually, when our own parenting, relying on what our grandmother and mother and uncles and fathers have modeled for us. But for some reason, there's this preference for new knowledge and a discarding of that of the past in a way that really trivializes it. The other thing is that concepts of time for First Nations people are really expansive, in that we have to not only honor the ancestral knowledge that's been passed down generations to generations, not just knowledge, but relationship and understanding and identity, but also be a custodian of that, because we will then in turn be passing that on to future generations. A lot of you may be familiar with the 7 generations model. In Western social work, we're often talking about a very limited scope of time. And we don't often think about what it is that our interventions have in store for that individual over their life course, or for that individual in a multi-generational fabric where their children and grandchildren may indeed be impacted by our work. The other thing is interconnection of time and space. This comes a lot when we talk about climate change. Climate change is a very Western kind of construct because it looks at the climate as a threat to humanity, versus for Indigenous peoples, we are of the land. It is part of who we are, and we're connected to everything around us. and therefore hold responsibilities for everything around us. And that those are things that we need to take care of. In a Western kind of point of view, is very reductionist. And in social work, we don't pay the type of attention we ought to be paying, in my view, to things like interconnection with land, interconnection with other peoples worldwide in terms of social relationships and social justice issues. It gets some attention, but not really in a focused way. The other thing is that there are multiple dimensions of reality. And I think it's important to know that Western physics has already confirmed this. So it's not First Nations are alone in this, and often have ceremonies to be able to access those other dimensions. That's really recognized as being something that has always been there. They're now giving out, scientific awards to those Western scientists who are now kind of treading onto this new understanding. But in social work, we really focus on just one dimension of reality. And it's not that I'm saying that we shouldn't, we need to kind of revamp and, entertain people who may be having different points of view, but it is about recognizing that this is a reality, this is part of an understanding of people, and it is true, and that social work ought to be at least taking that into consideration. The other thing is a premise of abundance, and this comes from Terry Cross's great work, of course, from the Seneca Nation. And really that his view is that First Nations feel that there's enough of everything in the world. It's not a matter of wildlife management or land management. It's a matter of managing our relationships to those things. That's what makes them scarce. It's not that they're scarce in and of themselves. So those are just a few of the worldviews that were really circulating prior to the colonialism that affected Indigenous peoples all over the world. But when we hear that word, not a lot of us really can kind of wrap our minds around it. And I think Eduardo Galeano really gives a very useful definition. And he talks about colonialism as kind of twofold. One is the more blatant colonialism that many of us are familiar with the Trail of Tears in the United States, residential schools in Canada, the taking of land and resources and of identity. And he says that blatant colonialism mutilates you without pretense. It forbids you to talk, it forbids you to act, and it forbids you to exist. In this particular presentation, I want to talk a lot about the other form that he brings our attention to, which is invisible colonialism. Invisible colonialism, however, convinces you that serfdom is your destiny and impotence is your nature. It convinces you that it's not possible to speak, not possible to act, and not possible to exist. It's often defined by what you don't see. And that's really the thing about systemic discrimination, in my view. It's often in what is not there that is the most potent form of the type of discrimination. And what is not there is often rooted in state government's policies, not only here in Canada, but worldwide. And we're going to take a look at a couple of those examples. The other thing is language is really important. And we've been hearing a lot of the good work being done by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and other racial justice movements worldwide. And the word racism often comes up. And although there's some historical debate about its beginning, a lot of people think that this is one of the earliest users of that word, and happens to be an American. His name was General Henry Pratt. And in 1902, he had taken up a post from his previous positions of looking after military prisons. And he was installed as kind of the supervisor of the Carlisle Industrial School for Native American children in the United States. Now, that's no surprise when you think about it, because then those types of boarding schools start taking on things like gender separation, giving kids numbers, lots of regimenting, a lot of punishment, poor nutrition. Many of these things that we associate with the incarceration system of that day, in fact, were ported into the system of care for Native American kids. But he made this quote, and he talks about racism, but probably not in a way that many of us would kind of think of it, in terms of he was kind of saying that he was against racism, but he was actually supporting racism, in that he felt there was necessary to blend the different races or classes in order to elevate the people who needed elevation. And that was never white men like himself. That was people of color, that was indigenous people that needed to be elevated. And in that way, he wasn't an anti-racist. He was really embedding racism. But he was a frequent user of the word racism, and maybe maybe the first or amongst the first to use it. And he used this phrase frequently. He said, kill the Indian, save the man. And Robert Williams, who many of you recognize from the University of Arizona, who wrote the book Savage Anxieties, really talks about this as being kind of the archetype of colonialism, where everything Western is civilized and everything First Nations is savage. And you see that playing out even in social work, I would argue today, although it's getting better thanks to the work of many of you who are probably tuning in. And when we talk about invisible colonialism, it's about the types of the ways we remember the past and what we don't remember about the past. We are around the globe united in this experience of the pandemic. But this is far from the first pandemic that Indigenous peoples in the Americas have experienced. In fact, this is a scientific article on climate change, where they had been able to link the changes in the climate in the Americas to what they call the Great Dying, which is 90% of the indigenous peoples of that time, following 1492, of the 100 years following 1492, are estimated to have perished as European powers moved on to the North, Central, and South American continents and into the Caribbean. And they introduced disease, but they did more than that. It wasn't just a mindless introduction of disease. There was willful murder. There was all kinds of malfeasance that contributed to the deaths of these people. And as the indigenous culture of sustainable living became displaced by a culture that looked at the land and resources as one of extraction, as something that can be consumed by humanity, we can actually markate that in climate change. And I want you to think for a moment, we've seen these horrifying death rates all over the world, and particularly in some regions of the country, such as in the United States. And every single one of those persons is sacred and cherished. And here, though, we had 90% of the community members dead. Can you imagine the loss of knowledge, experience, and the introduction of profound grief that would happen in those circumstances? And that was the introduction between Indigenous peoples and the European powers that would come to settle our various countries. Here's another way where it's really kind of invisible, in that we have seen the staggering rates of COVID disproportionately affecting different populations. In the United States, it disproportionately affects Black persons, Hispanic persons, and Native Americans. And one of the hardest hit communities is the Navajo Nation. Now, there's been some coverage about the fact that the Navajo Nation, some of the homes don't have water, just like that little boy at the beginning of my talk. And of course, trying to do COVID prevention and when you have no water is very difficult. So there's been some coverage on CBS and other networks about that. But what people really haven't stood back and looked at is the systemic discrimination that puts the Navajo at higher risk in the first place. And that is in the federal inequalities in fundings for reservations in the United States. So here is some data from the US that shows that when the federal government funds for federally incarcerated prisoners, the per capita amount for healthcare is about $69.73. This is 2016 data. But for Native Americans, in contrast, it's $1,297. Now, I'm not arguing that federally incarcerated prisoners should get less, but certainly it shows that there's a huge gap in even the way the federal government in the United States is funding healthcare for Native American persons. And of course, those inequalities stretch across all other public programs on reservations in the United States, education, health. That's the same thing in Canada. The federal government funds services for First Nations on reserves, and they do so at far lesser levels. And that makes people much more prone to this type of disease. The other thing is the displacement of land. So prior to colonialism, First Nations peoples and Inuit peoples in Canada owned 100% of the land. And often there's a sense of that we're greedy, that we want more than our share in these treaty and land claim settlements. But today we only have 0.02% of Canada's land mass. The numbers are a bit better in the United States, but still very insignificant compared to the type of land occupation and use and ownership that Native American people had in the past. So it's important to kind of really challenge this savage civilized dichotomy and some of the narratives that continue to echo forward up until today's context. And here is another piece that is invisible. We've had, no matter where you've lived in the world, the real tragedies of colonialism as governments have tried to assimilate or indeed to eliminate altogether Indigenous populations. And in Canada, we had residential schools. They operated from 1870s up until 1996, and they really were about assimilation. They were this idea that First Nations were savage, therefore we needed to remove their kids and make sure they were properly cared for. It was really the earliest iteration of the child welfare system. And in fact, the warrants from 1895 say you can remove kids to put them into these institutions because they're not properly cared for. And of course, that was according to those Western standards and according to very racist views about the type of care and compassion and love and nurturing that First Nations communities were offering their children. Now, in these schools, the children were often abused. They were punished for speaking their languages. Many of them died from preventable causes of disease. Then we had those schools closed. The government was sued by courageous survivors. It apologized. And then we had something called the 60s scoop, which was a mass removal of children of which the federal government was again involved. Same sequence, gets sued, apologizes. And then we have today, where First Nations children in Canada are 12 times more likely to be put in foster care than other children. And one of the major causes is those underfunding of services for First Nations communities that really disadvantage those children and their families across a whole array of areas. But the question that never gets answered is what has the government learned from the past? And also, indeed, what did social work learn? Because social work was involved as an active agent in each of these types of actions. In residential schools, they served on committees, admissions committees. They removed children during the 60s scoop. And today, social work is also an active actor in the removal of children and the failure to really address and hold accountable the Canadian state for the systemic discrimination that disadvantages First Nations families. So why don't we talk about reconciliation? One of the things I can say about Canada, and I would suggest that you have conversations with Indigenous peoples wherever you are to find out, is that this type of disadvantage that we see for First Nations children exists despite having tons of answers on the books already. If you look back at the reports going back hundreds of years in Canada, so many reports are on the books showing these inequalities, showing that really the derogation of First Nations knowledges and experience and capacity to care for their kids, when they really should be the key decision makers. They should be self-determining what happens with their families. These types of recommendations don't just date back decades, they date back over a century. And so what we have to get better at is implementing the recommendations that are already on the books. And here's just one of those reports. This is this kind of speaks to the narrative that I often hear, which is, oh, well, you know what? Those residential schools, so many kids died there, but people didn't know any better back then. But that is often said by persons who have not done the work of really looking at the historical documents. And what I'm showing you here is a newspaper from Ottawa, which is our capital city here in Canada, in 1907. And it's quite timely because for today's discussion around the pandemic, because it's covering a story about Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, the chief medical health officer of the Indian Department, who had just come back from doing a survey of the health of kids in residential schools and found that they were dying at prolific rates, tragic rates. 25% of kids were dying each year. And if you map that over 3 years, over half of the children would be dead. In fact, it was not unusual to walk past graveyards to go to the front entrance of a school. Can you imagine? So One of the things that Bryce said, though, is this can be solved. He realized that the population of people in Ottawa were getting 3 times as much healthcare funding than all of what they called Indians back in the day across the entire country. He said, even that out, and then here are some things that'll sound very familiar to you. He said, these children are dying of tuberculosis, so make sure that you don't put sick kids in with healthy children. Make sure the buildings are well ventilated. Make sure there's proper sanitation. All of these things that we're hearing as good public health guidelines in COVID, in fact, were known to public health professionals back in the day. It would have cost the government of Canada about $10,000 to $15,000 to implement those reforms, and they chose not to. And I think that's important to recognize that I use the word choice because we often use the word fail. And that implies that they didn't know any better. In this case, the government had the scientific evidence. It knew it could save lives. It made a determined choice to ignore those recommendations and allow the kids to suffer. This gets leaked out to the newspapers, and the editors of those papers across the country put this on the front page. And you can see this headline, Schools Aid White Plague, Starting Death Rolls Revealed. And one of the persons reading that article was a lawyer, Samuel Hume Blake, and he said that in the Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with the charge of manslaughter. So people of the period not only knew this was wrong, they thought it might be criminal. And so that's very important that we kind of pull back the onion when we look at what was happening then and who the people of the period are. Because that people of the period argument is often used to insulate ourselves from that type of accountability. We often think, well, we're no better now, so it would never happen again. But as I'm going to show you, it's still happening in a big way. So 1946, the Canadian Association of Social Workers appears before a House of Commons committee. And they know about residential schools. There's been regularly newspaper reports about the harms to kids, but they actually don't recommend against their closure. They make a statement in favor of assimilation. But they do point out those inequalities in services for First Nations communities and think that they fall far short of the standards that were involved. But here's a kind of a problem that we noticed in looking at the social work history, is even when social workers were doing the good work of documenting inequalities, they wouldn't take it that next step and actually do something about it beyond reporting on it. So we're going to go rapidly forward in time. We're now at 1967, which happened to be Canada's 100th birthday. And you can see the Department of Indian Affairs requisitioned a report from this social worker, George Caldwell. And George was sent out to schools in Saskatchewan, residential schools. And he found that 80% of the kids were there under that not properly cared for provision. So in Canada, when we talk about the 60s scoop, which was generally understood to be provinces and territories bringing children into care, Indigenous children into care, and adopting them out into non-Indigenous families. We think about the provincial child welfare system, but at the same time, we had these residential schools that were also acting as child welfare placements. And he reiterates what Dr. Bryce had iterated back in 1907. He says, look, we need more resources for the Indian family so they can care for their own children. And where they need to be brought into care, the resources ought to be given to the Indian community. So that's just another example of this recommendation coming forward. Now, we use the word overrepresentation a lot to talk about the situation of First Nations children today. And sadly, they're the top of every list you don't want to be at the top of, and the bottom of every list you do want to be at the top of. And the problem with that word is it's too easy to say, I think. We get used to it, right? Overrepresentation of Black youth in juvenile justice, or overrepresentation of First Nations youth in juvenile justice. I like to instead think of it the way children think of it. This is Department of Indian Affairs data federally, and it only deals with First Nations kids on reserve and in the Yukon. It counts the number of sleeps that First Nations kids have spent in foster care between 1981 and 2017. And you can see for Canada, that adds up to 78 million sleeps. That number is in place because of, in Canada, on reserve, as is the case in reservations in the United States. Every public service is underfunded, including child welfare. And what we knew about child welfare is, as of about 2000 2016, First Nations kids were still getting about maybe 60, 70 cents on the dollar compared to non-Indigenous kids in child welfare alone. And then those same kids weren't getting equitable treatment in education, early childhood programs, or just basic fun things like having a safe place to play. And the other problem is that the reserve boundaries were set over 100 years ago, but they never increased with population growth. So we have overcrowding in the housing, and the housing itself is often in really inadequate condition. So in 2007, the Assembly of First Nations, which is our political national organization, and the Caring Society for whom I work, we filed a human rights complaint against Canada saying that, look, you have the economic and also the social science evidence before you to rectify these inequalities, and you have consistently chosen not to do it. That means you are systemically racially discriminating against kids. We filed that case in 2007. They fought it on procedural grounds for many years, but finally we got the judgment, and that came in 2016. And this is a landmark decision that really showed that the government of Canada was currently systemically racially discriminating against children by failing to really provide equitable services, and the government was ordered to stop. Now, as far as we're aware, this is the only kind of national decision we've seen where it's actually focused on what's happening now. So often Canada or other governments will harm generations of children, and then when they grow up, only then do they offer some kind of apology. But the behavior often seems to echo forward and disadvantage future generations. And the tribunal found a couple of things. The inequality was causing unnecessary family separations, just as we knew it was. And the second thing is it was contributing to the deaths of some children. The other thing that it found is a very daunting consistency in Canada's own behavior, and that it really hadn't behaved very differently now than it did back in 1907 when Dr. Bryce was raising the alarm. Too often it was defensive, it really wouldn't engage in the critiques, and it was really mired in a colonial mindset that allowed for this type of discrimination to continue. And just to give you a sense of how deeply embedded it was, here's a photo on the left of Jordan River Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation. He's a little boy who was staying in a hospital for 2.5 years for medical reasons. But then his second birthday, he would be discharged into a family home. And if he was any other child, he would have been. But because he was First Nations, the government of Canada argued with the province, or kind of our equivalent of the states, argued with the province of Manitoba about who should pay for his at-home care. Because for other kids, the provinces pay for it. But this is a First Nations kid. So Manitoba was thinking the government of Canada should pick it up. Government of Canada was looking at all of its bureaucracy and departments thinking, well, we're not sure about that. So what they decided to do is leave this little kid in a hospital while they argued over who should pay because of his race. He sadly stayed there for 2.5 years before he passed away, never spending a day in a family home. And Jordan's principle was birthed out of his experience by his family and his family's desire to never see a child go through it. And it really is about making sure that First Nations children get the public services they need when they need them, free of any discrimination because they're First Nations. The House of Commons in Canada adopted Jordan's principle unanimously in 2007. And then the Canadian government went about crafting an approach for Jordan's principle and a definition for Jordan's principle that was so narrow, no child ever qualified. So the group of bureaucrats in the Department of Indian Affairs, whose job it was to ensure that there were 0 Jordan's principle cases, were given the highest public service award by the government of Canada in 2011 by their deputy minister. So racial discrimination against children was not just normative within the department, it was award-winning as of 2011. And in these documents, they cite that they're getting critiques from Canadian Medical Association, from teachers, from provinces, from territories, from auditor generals, from First Nations, and they're being rewarded for not responding to those critiques and those calls for action. So this is how people can report a Jordan's principle case today. Now that we've had the decision from the tribunal and several non-compliance orders against the Canadian government, this past year alone, First Nations children have received over 250,000 services and products that they otherwise would be denied. And we don't think that Canada is at full compliance yet, but it's a real tribute to Jordan and his memory that many children have been able to get that small measure of relief under the heavy weight of the type of ongoing systemic colonialism that the Canadian government is perpetrating upon them. So here's some of the patterns I picked up in the government of Canada's behavior, but I also think they have a way of informing social work about how we allow for this kind of egregious apartheid service delivery system to perpetuate in our countries without giving it the due attention that such a regime ought to prevail from social workers. The one is the language around it. It's often marketed by an approach where, well, Indigenous people need to be patient, that we, the government, are making good first steps, or we've done more than any other government before us. We can't change things overnight. That is another big one. And the reality is all we're asking for is culturally based equity for First Nations kids. That's something Canada already does for every other kid in the country. So why is this all of a sudden so complicated? And even if it was complicated, when Canada was negotiating trade agreements around the world, even with people who are, shall we say, very eccentric and I think really immoral politicians, they don't raise complexity as an issue. They soldier through it. They get the job done. So why should there be any excuse for saying to a child that you get less because of your race? There simply isn't. But this is the type of language that allows for that to continue ongoing. Another thing for social workers, and in child welfare in particular, but also for therapeutic interventions, is we need to avoid codifying structural discrimination as a personal deficit. Governments do this a lot. I see a lot of government ministers going to communities where there's been a tragic suicide crisis, and they're upset. They say, oh, we'll get counselors in there, but they're doing nothing about the underlying inequalities that are resulting in those children, young people being at greater risk for that type of experience. And so what we need to make sure is that we are not reinforcing that codification of structural discrimination as a personal deficit. That when we do child welfare investigations, we indeed ask, what does this person reasonably have control over? And then what they don't have control over it, then we need to prevail as social workers in social justice to address the systemic discrimination that this family is experiencing that is in turn putting their child at risk. The other is dehumanization. And I think that we're sometimes not paying enough attention to this. The government would often use acronyms or call the kids a file or program instead of really looking at the impacts of their action. And I think it's really essential that we do that. The other is intervention and systemic discrimination in ways that aren't proportionate to the harm. It's not enough to do a press release. When we filed that human rights complaint against the federal government as a First Nations NGO, we lost all of our federal government funding in 30 days. But miraculously, we survived. We're a very small organization. But the reason that we took that step is because of some advice from an elder that I pass on to you. That elder told us when we just set up the Caring Society, he said, never fall in love with the Caring Society. Never fall in love with the business card. Only fall in love with the children, because there may come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And it was really clear to us that every one of those kids was more important than our organization. And every one of those kids was more important than my job. It's our job as social workers to stand in the winds of that racial discrimination and with persons who are experiencing it every day and take the headwinds of it. And that means sacrifice and building up our moral courage in order to do that. Governments will often point for reform everywhere but itself. And I think social work sometimes does this too, is that we need to really look at our role in colonialism. How is it that we're still sidecasting those traditional and sacred teachings of Native American people, and not maybe making them an elective course in a social work regime, maybe having, one or two kind of professional development experiences about it, but not really deeply thinking about how it might change the way that we would relate and respect and do our casework with families. Defending versus appraising critique. This is really important to surround ourselves, not just with people who think about it like us, but also, and I think sometimes more importantly, with people who don't think like us. And to really embrace critique as an opportunity to enrich the types of work that we're doing with families and friends. And the other is mistaking process for outcome. This is often done in social work, where we will see systemic discrimination, we'll call for an inquest, we'll call for an inquiry. And what that does is that feeds back to that difference in worldview, where we give a premium on contemporary information. We sometimes don't think that maybe there are reports already on the books that already have these solutions, and that by getting involved in this inquest, what we're doing is creating the illusion that the government or other institution is doing systemic change, but they're really not changing things on the ground for people. And of course, overstating First Nations involvement. It's very important that we act in concert with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And you can find a lot of good educational videos on that just on Google. So take a look at it and you'll see how that can guide your work. This is the report we did at PAHO. It's another resource for you. It was headed by Sir Michael Marmot. And I really want to make a big plug for equity being in a cornerstone of all of our social work education. And some social work schools do it better than others, and some social services organizations are very strong as well, but we all need to get up to speed on it. Because really equity is as close as we have as a silver bullet in social sciences. By addressing inequalities in our own communities and within our own countries, we can have a host of benefit effects across health, education, justice systems, you name it. It really is something that where you do that one thing, you link whatever you're doing to reducing inequalities, and you can have these broad array of impacts. But while we're doing this work, we actually had a focus on persons of Indigenous and Afro descent. And what they were telling us is that the determinants of health are not really culturally neutral. They really are culturally loaded in that Western construct. So we introduced some new aspects to that determinants of health framework in the PAHO report. And one of those, of course, is recognition of the land. So, and recognition of the ongoing and historical impacts of colonialism and structural racism. So I really recommend you take a look at it. It might be helpful in kind of reconceptualizing some of your work. And in Canada, and as a result of the tribunal's decision, we are actually building social work from a funding formula. Because really, when you look at governments, that's where the rubber really hits the road, is whether or not they're prepared to spend the money. And instead of asking the question, how much would it cost to run a child welfare organization? We ask the question, how much would it cost for a First Nations child to thrive? How much would it cost to make sure that little boy had clean water? How much would it cost to get rid of poverty? How much would it cost to make sure that First Nations children no longer are getting broadband access in only 35% of their homes in the middle of a pandemic? That's the type of question we should be asking for, because our goal ought to be full equity. It should not feed into the toxic potion of incremental equality for children, and especially children. For children, equality needs to come in a leap, not in a shuffle. And that's why we have the Spirit Bear Plan. Spirit Bear Plan is asking for a costing of all the inequalities in First Nations children's services on reserve by the federal government. And then let's do something like the Marshall Plan and fix it. If we can rebuild Europe in 9 years, we can do this. And the other part of it is, let's evaluate this government department. Let's figure out why the Department of Indian Affairs has been around for 153 years, did residential schools, did 60 scoop, has been found racially discriminating today, and is still in non-compliance of orders. Why it doesn't do better when it knows better for families. And I think this is a useful exercise for all governments. I know in my organization, even though we're tiny, we've actually undergone 2 independent evaluations. And I find it really, really helpful, because our goal is to do right, not to be right. And so that's the Spirit Bear Plan. We also, Spirit Bear was a teddy bear that witnessed all of the tribunal hearings. He represents all the First Nations children. And when children started coming to the hearings, he really became their superstar. And that was the really a highlight of it, is that kids of all diversities started filling this courtroom to listen to all sides of the argument, to find out what was going on for First Nations kids. And they really have taught me a lot about advocacy. And they really embraced Spirit Bear, and Spirit Bear became their Ambarister. So we have all kinds of activities for children of all diversities to get involved in, to learn about the past, but also learn about the contemporary injustices, and then take that next step, which is how can you, even as a child, make sure that you're an active participant in the social movement to change all of that for the better. And we have done things like changing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action to remedy, to support reconciliation. We change those into kid-friendly language. We have a calendar so that people at home can do free activities every month with their children to teach them about the TRC's calls to action, which are things to remedy residential schools, but colonialism writ large. And we also now have a brand new animation where we took the story of all those children coming to the tribunal and learning about the systemic discrimination and acting out in ways that were peaceful and respectful, but calling on the government of Canada to address it. You know, sometimes I think we were worried as adults about being too political. But the reality is the headwaters of disadvantage for all kinds of populations of persons is often located in our government houses. So I think it's critical that we are political. It's equally critical that we're nonpartisan. And so we teach children that the people that can make this different are working in this particular house. So if you send your drawing or your letter to the Prime Minister, then you can help him be better informed and hopefully make a better choice for First Nations kids. And now we're doing it via animation too. So I think I'll conclude there. I just want to say what a great honor it is to give this small introduction into not only colonialism and the great work that Native American, Alaskan Native, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and other Indigenous people are doing around the world, but also as a call to action to social workers. We have 7 free ways that you can make a difference on our website in under 2 minutes. And go there and take a look at them and see and work with the Indigenous communities in your areas to see what those 7 free ways might look like for them. And then let's get busy, because let's face it, every kid matters. And we're never gonna be the type of society we want when we still tell children that they have to wait or they're gonna get less because of who they are. There's no place in a civilized world for a child to have to go on to TV and say that they're not an animal, that they're a human being. So thank you very much.
Cindy, I have been taking notes throughout to your conversation. This has just been a fabulous, fabulous presentation. Again, I really want to thank you for what you've given us today, but also what you've given us throughout your career in really lifting up First Nations and helping us understand. I love a number of things that you've said. I'm just like, this has got to be a bumper sticker. Like we need to make sure that we're not complacent about, you know, this incremental inequality, reducing inequality just incrementally, like equity. It's a bold action that we need to stand for now. And I just really want to thank you. I know that we've got lots of people who have asked questions. I've asked Julie Rhodes to come into the room. She's going to moderate those questions. Julie Rhodes, for all of you, is the CSWE Director of the Department of Educational Initiatives and Research. And Julie, thank you so much for helping us out. And you're going to feed those questions to Cindy. Thank you.
Thanks, Darla, and thanks again, Cindy. So our first question, Deborah, she says, greetings from the Yukon Territory. There are 7 self-governing First Nations here in the territory. To what extent do you feel the support of Indigenous sovereignty helps support the impact of colonialism?
Well, I think that there was really deliberate attempts to undermine sovereignty. That's one of the cores of colonialism. It gets back to that dichotomy of the savage and the civilized that was improperly foisted onto First Nations and Indigenous peoples writ large. And what do we need to do if we're really going to come to terms with that is that governments need to respect the fact that Indigenous people actually can make the best decisions for their children. And yes, we will screw up from time to time, but we have for thousands of years survived our own mistakes. what is becoming very hard to survive are the mistakes of non-Indigenous governments that have really created what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called cultural genocide towards our children. We were never doing that. And so we need that self-determination, but then we need more than that. We need the resources to make that vision of self-determination real in our respective communities.
Great, thank you. And how core to our beliefs as social workers, right? So the next comment is about the concept of scarcity. And what ways do you address this in your classroom or throughout your assignments?
I talk about really we need to shift the focus. It was like an elder who really was talking about, while a young environmentalist came to him and said, oh, we're going to set up a park near you. Aren't you really excited about that? You know, a natural park. And he wasn't excited. And this young environmentalist couldn't figure out why. And it was because he said, in our worldview, the whole world is a park. And what we need to do is manage our own human behavior. This temptation that all humanity has towards greed, and really manage that in a way. And also get a full appreciation and respect for the natural world around us. And our duty to that 7 generations around down the line. You know, if we fell in love with the generation that we would never know, and we conducted our lives in a way that would be good for them, that would, I think, fundamentally shift the way that we act in the world. Many of us just think, especially in Western social work, about our own children and maybe our grandchildren. But our challenge in social work, I think, is to fall in love with that generation who will never know us, to act in ways that really keep their well-being, their safety, their humanity within a natural world, really at the forefront of our decision-making.
Great, thank you. So the next question is from Alan. He says, thank you for helping us understand colonialism and its ongoing impacts. What are some examples of successful approaches to collaborations between Indigenous communities and BSW or MSW programs?
Right.
We actually we had one comment from Christopher Sharp, who's at Arizona State, was stating about his program. So I wonder if you have others that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, we've actually had something here led by one of our leaders, Dr. Joan Glode, who is now retired. But she partnered with Dalhousie University, and they created actually one of the first, it's called the Mi'kmaq Maliseet BSW program in the country. So there are some initiatives like that, but the problem is that there's still kind of pockets. And also the University of Victoria does a good job of that, kind of integrating First Nations, Métis, and Inuit worldviews. So there are some positive examples. What I would like to do is kind of see a lot more emphasis on also overlaying that advocacy on systemic discrimination into those curricula. Because sometimes I feel that that's missing, about how do you actually advocate and how do you stand in the winds of that type of discrimination in a way that's morally courageous? And how do we support people who are often being punished for being morally courageous, right? We'll call them, they're rocking the boat, you know, they're difficult to work with, when they're really, they're fighting against this incremental equality approach. How do we support those people, and how do we become one of them, right? Because you know, to quote the wonderful John Lewis, it is our job to get into good trouble, right? But we don't train social workers how to do that in a very good way. And at least I don't think we're doing them the justice that the students deserve in terms of being equipped with those types of knowledges.
Great, thank you. And what a great way to quote John Lewis there. So the next comment again is from Christopher, and he says, thanks for sharing. I wholly agree that funding is the biggest injustice. Tribal programs have been funded at 60% of the need in the US for over a century, and there should be no wonder why there are health disparities. Yeah. He was on a webinar, and less than 1% of the title funding funds are distributed to tribal programs, even though they are eligible to apply for over a decade now. And what are some strategies that you might suggest for adequately advocating for equitable funding? Well,
a couple of things. I think one is really that public education piece. And I've really been impressed by the great works of Framework Institute, as well as George Lakoff. I'll write it in the chat book. George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant. It helps you frame the inequality in a way that pierces through the normalization of colonialism that has allowed that discrimination to happen. I don't know about you, Christopher, but here in Canada, many people think First Nations not only get the same amount as everybody else, they get more and are not grateful of it. So this narrative has been woven for us that really masks the deep inequalities and the apartheid service delivery system that has existed in Canada. And we see it in Canadians' enthusiasm, for example, to get involved in the anti-apartheid campaign in South Africa, while we still have the Indian Act and we have an apartheid service regime here in Canada. So we got to frame our message in a way that gets through that. The second is create opportunities that are free of charge and easy to do for any member of the public, but especially children, to become active and meaningful change makers. And then the third thing is litigation. I think that we really do have to move into those spaces. I find a lot of Aboriginal law is based on lands and resources, as it should be. But I think we need to take on more of these systemic human rights cases. And in your case, of course, you have the constitutional, equality provisions. So I think that there's something that might be there. You have got some amazing, talented Native American, Alaskan Native lawyers who could take that up for you. I can only say that in Canada, we haven't been given anything. Our kids haven't been given everything. We've had to fight for everything we've gotten in the courtrooms, in the public consciousness. And we are making some headway, but there's more to do.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your work in there as well. So the next question is, again, thanking you for your important work and service to the First Nations people, including children. And how much attention is paid to the spiritual dimension of these children and their families?
Not nearly enough. I think we tend to be really afraid of spirituality in general. In fact, it doesn't even appear in the Canadian government's iteration of the determinants of health, which is another big gap, right? Because people seem to be afraid of it. They oh, well, it's religion. It might be religion, but it's more than that. It really is. There's a poem that has always inspired me in my life by Patrick Overton. And it says, faith is that place when you step across where light leads into darkness, knowing there's something solid to stand on or you'll be taught to fly. And when I had the great privilege of working with children, young people, and families directly, that really, I saw that in families often and in children often. Children who have come from very difficult experiences still had that glimmer inside of them that there was something solid to stand on or they'll be taught to fly. And I think it's our job as social workers to nurture that within people, whatever it means for them, not to be kind of foisting our own beliefs onto them, but to acknowledge it and to provide opportunities to nurture that.
Great, thank you. So just one last question here. And the last question is, they love the creation of your video for the project. And so what are some other ways that you see art being beneficial to bridging Indigenous and non-Indigenous people?
What we found for the children, as also all of our campaigns, is we invite all children of all diversities into these campaigns. In fact, we have something called Have a Heart Day, where children write Valentines to the elected officials so that First Nations children can grow up safely in their families, be healthy, get a good education, and be proud of who they are. And during non-COVID times, we literally have thousands of children in front of Parliament Hill with signs and with microphones reading their letters to the prime ministers. So we have all kinds of learning resources and ways that children can get involved and ways the public can get involved in these campaigns on our website. And if they're of some inspiration to you and you're able to use them to help children in your communities, please contact us. We're all about sharing. Our goal is to make a difference for children. So if there's something we're doing that's helpful, that's great. We're willing to share it. The only thing we'd ask is, please let us know what you do with it so we can learn from your example too.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. And I'm going to pass it over to Darla for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you again, Cindy. I'm just going to end with, we need to fall in love with the generation that we will never know and never know us. I think that's just a really beautiful thought. So thank you again. Very much honored to have you here with us today for our Hokenstad Lecture. Very worthy acknowledgement of the good work that you're doing. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Just real quickly, I want to make sure that folks know that last night we had a screening of the documentary Coded Bias. I hope you got a chance to see it. Tonight, instead of having a live Q&A with the director, there will actually be a pre-recorded interview with her built on some of the questions that you submitted during the screening. And then this session will be added to our list of on-demand sessions, which are available throughout the year for all conference attendees. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.